I'm going to take the devil's advocate and say why giving the billions of dollars we've given to Ukraine has actually been good for the United States in the long run.
I hate to be such a Trump fangirl on this, but the reality is that it's kind of a weak argument, but at the same time, we've seen it before.
I don't think you're going to negotiate your way out of what China wants.
But
I really like, what Trump is doing as far as pushing for the end of the war, whatever means necessary. And when he was running this last time and the reporter asked him if he thought Ukraine could win, which is a very leading question, because how does Ukraine win? Is that, does Ukraine take out Russia? How is this war going to end? And they asked him, can Ukraine win? And he did not buy into that, winning-losing dichotomy. He responded by saying,
I want everybody to stop dying, Russians and Ukrainians.
And that is definitely his focus. And I think that that's a fair focus to take. If I can throw in a crazy wrench to this conversation, if we still have time, if y'all want to do something a little fun here.
Let's do it.
I'm going to take the devil's advocate. I'm going to tell you guys, I'm going to take the Warhawk perspective here. And I'm saying, I'm not saying that I actually agree with all these points, but I do think there is something to be said for some of these points. So I'm going to take the Warhawk perspective and say why we did the right thing, why supporting the war in Ukraine and giving the billions of dollars we've given to Ukraine has actually been good for the United States in the long run. So here is that perspective. 2 points. The first point is we signed an agreement back in the day saying that we would protect Ukraine. You all remember the Cold War? Everybody had nukes. Ukraine actually had the third largest stockpile of nukes of any country in the world. And they were an independent country after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so in 1994, the US, the UK, and Russia brokered an agreement with Ukraine for saying, hey, Ukraine, do away with all your nukes, get rid of them, and we will guarantee your security. Obviously, Russia's probably broken it by invading Ukraine at this point, but we actually have a document that we signed as a government back in the 90s saying, hey, Ukraine, if you do away with your nukes, we'll support your security. Here's the next big point, and this is a very large point. What we're doing, having a proxy war in Ukraine, is the right thing to do because there is a East versus West global war that we're building up to, and it is inevitable. Here's some of the subpoints to it. First off, this war has been a low-cost way
monetarily.
Low cost to the United States. The United States isn't losing lives. Ukraine is, but the United States is not.
Just sacrifice them. Who cares about that? Yeah.
We've given over $70 billion in weapons. However, those weapons don't actually cost us necessarily $70 billion because we're giving them old weapons. We're constantly updating our arsenal and we're replacing. And the old weapons, they sit around and then eventually we have to recycle them. But when we recycle them, it costs money. So this is one of the arguments is that's an inflated number. We actually haven't given them quite as much aid as people say because we're counting how much those weapons cost when we bought them. And this leads into, well, why do we want to hurt Russia? Well, the reason we want to hurt Russia is actually because of China.
I'm going to break in for a second and say, if you're enjoying this episode, stick around. And at the end, I'm going to show you how you can get access to exclusive content that's only found on locals.com.
They are gaming up right now to go to war. President Xi Jinping, he has fired all of his generals that don't want to go to war. He's hired people that do want to go to war. He's stockpiling weapons. He's stockpiling grain. They have been trying to exert their influence over the entire world for years now. They steal hundreds of billions of dollars worth of intellectual property from the United States. They've hacked our treasury. They steal our phone conversations. They steal our text messages. China is pressuring countries and governments and private corporations to censor anything that's anti-China. And so they've been exerting this force for a long time. And some people estimate that they're going to invade Taiwan in probably about 2 years. If China ends up becoming more aggressive and actually starts physically invading countries, do we just let them do whatever they want? Or are we going to go into a full-scale East versus West war? Russia will most likely side with China, along with like Iran and North Korea. And so by doing this, we're currently costing Russia hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives. We're using up their military. And the last point is we're also learning by observing how to fight in a modern war, fight with drones, fight against drones, fight with GPS blockers, because some of our missiles Russia was able to counter just by jamming our GPS sensors. And that's something that is new. And so we're learning modern techniques leading up to essentially an inevitable East versus West war. And so this proxy war is just a way to hurt our enemies. What do you guys think about that?
I appreciate that perspective that you gave there as the advocate for the other side. But I will say this, if the real goal was to protect Ukraine, the actions we've seen taken over the last few years are not the actions that would be taken. And it wouldn't have been behind the scenes like, hey, you should go say that. Like, and it would have been a more upfront way to actually deal with something. Absolutely. There is a mounting conflict rising with China. But here's the thing. If there's a war coming, hurting Russia is the opposite of what we should be doing, because that's pushing Russia to China, and that's two strong world powers together. We should be doing things that divide Russia from China and make Russia not want to partner with China.
I think the argument against that point, Ryan, would be some people would respond and say there's no way to separate Russia and China. Like, there's no way Russia would side with the United States ever.
I'm not saying we got to be buddies with them. It's a frenemy.
Right.
It's a frenemy. It's like,
I get that point. I think that's how some people would push back and say Russia is always going to side with a country like China.
But what you do, and this is what Trump would do from a business perspective is you have some sort of economic ties and some sort of different things there that it's not an ally per se, but it's something to where they're going to have to destroy their own interests to really come against the U.S. Like, that's what you need to do. And you set this up in a way so that is the case. Because right now, they are getting, their interests are to go and help partner with China. And China, we know the Belt and Road and everything they're doing and all. I mean, it's a different game now.
So to respond to the 2 points, Reese, number one, when it comes to the agreement to protect the Ukraine, I think some people could make the argument that we have fulfilled our end of the agreement up to this point, or at least at some point it was fulfilled. And when it became clear that Ukraine was not going to win, at whatever point that was, 2022, 2023, whatever that means. Yeah. Whatever that means, whenever that became clear, we need to protect them in another way, which would be to say, we're going to end the fighting. We're going to push for peace talks, and we're going to try to protect people's lives. Are we protecting the nation, or are we protecting the country? Two different things. Are we protecting the people, or are we protecting the government? And the people's lives are more important than the government. So that would be
such a Trump fangirl on this, but the reality is that we have
fanboy. It's fanboy. Just to be clear about that. Okay.
Maybe a good way to put it is, I don't mean to be Trump blind. How's that? Is that
sure?
So
Kool-Aid.
The reality is that we've seen before where these massive world leaders will come out and say something crazy. Trump goes and meets with them, and then all of a sudden they've changed their tune. And so it's like when we talk about China, Russia, North Korea, all these big powerhouses that could be potentially going to war, we are dismissing the history that Trump has had with all of these countries and how he has actually been the, once again, master negotiator of all things. And somehow it ends up diverting away from war. It's kind of a weak argument, but at the same time, we've seen it before.
I don't think you're going to negotiate your way out of what China wants.
Well, go ahead.
Even if you've got someone like Trump doing the negotiating, from what the pattern we're seeing with China, I think Reese is right with his setup that they are escalating there, and they're continuing to escalate towards something.
Yeah. So let me kind of give a business perspective on this. So Trump is a businessman, and he knows how to use leverage, and we've seen all of our leadership just throw away our leverage and not use it at all. So I had a negotiation we did with a company that was a U.S. company, and they had operations. So I've done these negotiations with 15 different countries, not government stuff, but business stuff. One of them was, hey, we need some cost reductions here. And they say, well, we don't do cost reductions. We can give you rebates, but that's it. And we said, okay, well, we're 20% of your factory's business. So you need to make the decision easy for us to keep the business there. Otherwise, we're not going to guarantee after 3 years. And they came to the table and negotiated. And we had another company that we said, bring your decision maker to the negotiation. They flew over from Italy. And if you don't bring, and they didn't bring the decision maker. So we said, either you get him on the phone right now, it's 8 p.m. in Italy, or you leave. And that's it. We're not negotiating. We left the room and we said, we'll leave the door closed. You open the door when you're ready for us to come back in and give us your answer. And we left the room. Dang. And they opened the door. They came in. And they had the guy on the phone. It's
I bet they did.
Right.
That is what's happening here. We have the leverage. And with China, like, we don't negotiate with a competitor. Like, it's not about necessarily negotiating with China. It's about putting ourselves in a position and China in a position and moving supply chains, moving all these kinds of things around to where you're using your leverage, you're using what you can do with other countries and positioning it. So it's very difficult for China to operate and advance their interests. And that's where Trump actually can come in and use that sense. And he's putting people's feet to the fire. That's where it's like people say, well, what do you mean if we don't pay our bill to NATO or you're not going to protect us? And he said, yes, right. You need to pay your bill and we're not going to protect. And then they had the biggest influx of money into that they've ever seen. So so there's my Ryan's rant for this episode. I got it.
If I could wrap up the conversation, I think you're right. I think you made a lot of good points. I do, like I said, I want to play devil's advocate and push the war hawk perspective. I do think, again, there are some points. There's definitely some things to be said about China. There's definitely some things to be said about global escalation. I do, however, my personal take, although it does make me feel a little better that some of that money that we've sent them is actually just older weapons that we weren't going to use anyways. That also does make me rethink how much money we're spending on our own defense if we have all these old weapons lying around that we're not doing anything with. But I think my larger perspective would be that, to your point, Ryan, it's like you can get creative with negotiations. You can get creative with the pressures and stuff. And I from the war hawk perspective, it really does seem like the expression, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's pretty much, what we've seen a lot of times, unfortunately, with these proxy wars. It's like, if the only thing you can think of and imagine is we're building towards World War III and we're building towards escalation, and we just have to constantly be fighting proxy wars until someday that eventually happens. It's like you've locked yourself into this mindset of like, I have a hammer, my hammer is war, and everything looks like a nail. And I don't think that's where we should be, for the sake of our country, the sake of the world, and I think we can be more creative to find more peaceful solutions, hopefully speaking. I've never heard this talked about in the mainstream media. I haven't heard any mention of there being tunnels. You said since the 90s? We've been aware of this since the 90s? I never
We've discovered 140 tunnels since 1990.
That is crazy.
They have a massive tunnel network that is a critical threat to Israel that they use for cross-border attacks. They use for weapon smuggling, people smuggling, terrorist activities, all kinds of things.
It gets crazy, the kinds of things that you can find online about what's actually going on. Walmart using the tunnels and the trucks going underground and all of that.